During this border crisis, the Soviets approached the United States and asked us whether it would be okay to nuke China. And we said, no, that would not be remotely okay to do that. And Mao figured it out. The one that wants to nuke you, that's the primary adversary. And so you look at Mao recalculating and thinking maybe it's time to gang up with the United States. So either way, there's this confluence of interest between the United States and China that Russia's their primary enemy, and what's going to go on is the hostility with China will force Russia to militarize its long frontier with China. And these aren't just average forces there. They're mechanized, they're nuclear equipped, etc. Really expensive. Imagine if this country had to maintain that sort of force on both our long Mexican and Canadian borders. I believe it would be bankrupting, right? And the Soviet economy was and remains a shrinking percentage of ours. So bad news for the Soviets when everyone gets around to, this is a lovely poster, the Chinese trying to smash the revisionists with this new plan. So some would argue that US cooperation with China fatally overextended the Soviet Union, and that is truly the reason why the Cold War ended the way it did. Completely different argument. Okay, now I'm going to take an additional overarching argument, which is going to look at all US presidents from Nixon to Reagan to say each one opened opportunities for the others. So you start with Nixon, who's going to play a China card, and then his successors are going to play it with ever greater dexterity. You're going to have Ford, who's going to bring in the Helsinki human rights things, that Carter is going to play even more aggressively. He begins a military buildup that Reagan then finishes, and there it positions the United States to deal with the Soviet Union from a position of ideological and military strength. So, P.S. For those of you who think that U.S. foreign policy is inconsistent, think again and think at the strategic level. For the entire 20th century, virtually, there was a consensus between the Republican and Democratic parties on the objective to keep free trade, maintain democracy, and contain communism. And it doesn't matter which party you are, you have different strategies for getting there, I got that. But the overarching objective was remarkably usual one. If you look at Soviet growth rates, they're really good after World War II when they're rebuilding. But then bad things start happening. So that by the time you get to the 80s, really bad things are happening. And here's how that goes. You can just look at it tanking there, and here's what's going on. Communist system, all the different subunits in whatever the enterprise is that you're working at are lying to everybody else. Why? To make sure they get enough resources to produce whatever they're producing. Here's the problem with that. That means neither they nor the government has any good economic data.
Sarah Paine makes it clear that the Soviet economy was built on a foundation of lies and bad information, which is a key failure of any centralized state. When no one knows the real value of labor or production, the entire system simply grinds to a halt. This deep-seated dishonesty is why command economies always collapse, proving that national strength requires truth from its elite.
Everyone's been lying to each other, so no one knows what's the real value of labor, what's the real value of capital, what is our actual productivity rate. It's a total mess. So by the time they start realizing there are problems afoot, because there have been these gross misallocations of capital and labor because no one knows what their value is, they're in a deep crisis. Total mess is on their hands. So if you look here, you got the Eastern Bloc and Russia there. So Russia from 85, which is the year Gorbachev comes in, goes over a cliff, and then it tanks in 1998. Long, hard, shrinking share of world GDP. And when Gorbachev's in there, all these figures are awful. Debt, deficits of all kinds are up and away. Growth has gone double-digit negative. It is what Gorbachev is doing. And if you look at people who are alive at the time living in Russia when Gorbachev is making all these very important decisions, they all agree. Whether they disagree with each other on other things, they all agree that Gorbachev played an absolutely pivotal role. There is a consensus on Russia on that one. And it turns out Gorbachev based his decision-making on certain false assumptions. And one of them was the irreversible direction of history, always forward to communism, never U-turn back to capitalism. And here you have a smart guy, the KGB FSB, head of foreign intelligence, who said, look, the thought never occurred to the government that it's possible to withdraw from socialism, which is precisely what Eastern Europe did.
The core of the problem, as Sarah Paine points out, was that Gorbachev and his government believed their own propaganda about history only moving one way. This blind faith meant the Soviet elite were completely shocked when Eastern Europe chose freedom over the false promises of socialism with a human face. This unbelievable lack of self-awareness is a definitive sign of elite failure.
Also, Gorbachev made false assumptions about his neighbors. He assumed that the clock had started when he took office and started making reforms. For the Eastern Europeans, the clock had started a long time ago when Stalin had moved in and shot up a lot of people and installed governments, that it was a different ballgame from their point of view. And here you have Anatoly Chernayev, who was an important advisor to Gorbachev, saying, Gorbachev thought that bringing freedom to Eastern Europe satellites would lead them to adopt socialism with a human face. He made an enormous mistake because these countries brutally turned their backs on us. Oh, if this is brutal, what was Stalin, right? And then he continued, he said, look, the politics in connection with our former friends were totally unexpected to us. Really? You move in, you occupy their countries, you shoot their leadership, you impose governments, you siphon off their resources for years, and you're surprised they don't like you? This is a jaw-dropping level of lack of self-awareness. Think about our country, the United States. The United States runs around all over the world intervening in other people's civil wars, left, right, front, and center. And then it dumps billions of dollars into their economies. And then it even leaves. And people don't like us. Why do the Russians think they're so special? Okay, another bad assumption. Gorbachev assumed that if there was no Warsaw Pact, that's all his alliance system with Eastern Europe, that surely NATO would disappear off the planet as well. And if there were no Comecon is the trading group of all the Eastern European countries, if that went, that surely the European community, European Union is the new name, European Community is the old name, that would disappear too. And he tells the Politburo, the Americans will definitely dissolve NATO because there's gonna be no Warsaw Pact. Well, he doesn't get it. Longevity, organizations that are voluntary versus involuntary is different, right? They die for different reasons. Last false assumption that Gorbachev made, he assumed that the United States would take a continental powers view, which is a very dim view of other strong powers, that the United States would not want a strong Germany because that's a dangerous thing to have around. And it would take this somehow trying to keep it weak, and he didn't get it. That George H.W. Bush, who was president then, and Chancellor Helmut Kohl, who was running West Germany, were coordinating to make a unified Germany, fully armed, fully in NATO. So Gorbachev never occurred to him that that would be the goal. Okay, for years and years and years, the Russians really wanted to hold a European-wide conference to confirm their expanded World War II borders. And they were just itching for this. And for years, no one was interested. But by the 1970s, the Western Europeans are just sick of it, and they want to settle out Europe because they actually have to live there. And we aren't, the United States is not enthusiastic at all. But the conference is held anyway. And we demand that in these Helsinki Accords that are going to be assigned, that they include all sorts of human rights clauses, even though we think the accords themselves aren't going to be unimportant, and that the Soviets, no way on the planet are they going to adhere to whatever human rights this and that they sign. Well, unbeknownst to us, dissident groups throughout the Eastern Bloc and human rights activists throughout the West started holding the Soviet Union and its Eastern Bloc allies accountable to the document they signed. And they pointed out the disconnect between the liberalization that is promised by communism and the actual dictatorship that was delivered. And these dissident groups in the Eastern Bloc took off and had a life of their own. Turns out that CART human rights campaign was effective. It resonated most profoundly among Eastern Europeans who were denied precisely the sorts of political rights that he was emphasizing. And here you have a commencement address at Notre Dame in 1977, and here's Carter. We have reaffirmed America's commitment to human rights as a fundamental tenet of our foreign policy. What draws Americans together is a belief in human freedom. We want the world to know that our nation stands for more than just financial prosperity. We're bigger than that. And it's Pavel Poloshenko, who was the translator for Gorbachev. He believed that Carter's human rights campaign was profoundly influential in the Soviet Union, where people listened to it and said, you know, we do need to become more democratic. We need to open up. We need to liberalize. And here you have Eduard Shevardnadze, who was the foreign minister in Russia. He's talking to the Communist Party members of the foreign ministry, which he runs, and here's what he tells them. The belief that we're a great country is deeply ingrained in me. But great in what? Territory, population, arms, troubles, lack of rights, life's disorderliness. In what do we, who have virtually the highest infant mortality rate on the planet, take pride? It is not easy answering the questions, who are you and who do you want to be? A country which is feared or a country which is respected? A country of power or a country of kindness? Half before that unification agreement is signed, this is when Saddam launches to move into Kuwait. And this is a problem. Why? Kuwait, Iraq was a very important Soviet client state. I believe it owed the Soviet Union then about $10 or $13 billion. We've established the Soviet Union is broke. It would really like to have some of that money back. And so the Russians there's a great deal of diplomacy with us about this war so it doesn't tank war termination in the big war, right? Think about it. The prize is not Saddam Hussein. Saddam Hussein is no prize, it's a piece of work. The prize is winning the Cold War, the really big ticket item, and focusing on how to do that. And also understand that the Red Army is not going to be fully out of East Germany and the Eastern Bloc, places where it doesn't belong, until 1994. Until that happens, Cold War termination isn't actually confirmed. So there's some delicate diplomacy going on. A lot of conversations between us and the Soviets. Gorbachev sends his personal emissary, Yevgeny Primakov, multiple times to Baghdad. After the first trip, Primakov gets all Soviet hostages out. After the second trip, he gets all Western hostages out. Third trip, not so lucky. He's there when we start dropping bombs all over the place. He was really nonplussed by that. But imagine if, during the bombing campaign, our human shields, had gone down with every target. It is the Russians who make sure that does not happen. Okay. It's also interesting that we're coordinating with the Russians to have the Russians coordinate to deal with the Chinese. And the Russians understand we're going to take unilateral, that we are going to do something about Iraq one way or the other. And they would prefer to have it go through the Security Council and not be unilateral because, look, it answers our interest for everything which takes place in the world be sanctioned by the Security Council where we have a vote. Well, it's more than a vote. We have a veto. And the Russians talk to the Chinese and say, don't you also want to have everything run through the Security Council where you also have a veto? And the Chinese said, gotcha. And so that's what they do. But there's an understanding here. Back to Kovalyov, the deputy foreign minister, he said, we must support the territorial integrity of Iraq. This was our sacred position. We must not permit the division of Iraq. So for those of you who wonder, why did the United States stop after 100 hours of ground combat? This is the reason why. We got to deal with the Soviets, which says, yeah, I'd get them out of Kuwait, but you don't get to go into Iraq. That's the deal. He's out of Iraq and not the rest of it. Bush got it. He understands that if he starts heading up towards Baghdad, that's going to going beyond the culminating point of victory in the Cold War. It is going to jeopardize everything that's going on in Europe. Stupid move, so he doesn't do it. Now, if we had done this, Margaret Thatcher, Prime Minister of Great Britain, and President François Mitterrand of France would have loved it. Why? They really don't want to see Germany unified. They're scared of it and totally unhappy. Now, François Mitterrand, he eventually finds solace in being a really central figure in negotiating the European Union that's going to include both Eastern and Western Europe and the Maastricht Treaty that makes it all happen. But Margaret Thatcher was never reconciled. She said, look, Germany will be the Japan of Europe, but worse than Japan. I guess she hadn't visited Japan lately. The Germans will get in peace what Hitler couldn't get in war. And her plan was to leave Soviet troops in Germany forever. Okay, imagine if that's what we're dealing with today. When you've got Putin, who's doing a number in different places in Europe. Bush and Kohl left a Germany that is large enough to counterbalance this man. And Germany currently has a very distinguished chancellor who's been working on it, Angela Merkel, who grew up in East Germany and knows all about this guy. So Bush, as a result, understanding what was going on, he promised Kohl that I won't beat my chest and dance on the Berlin Wall. The idea is that he was never going to brag about how his strategy had won the Cold War, or the war termination had been so very, very clever. Why? Because if he had done that, it depends when he does it. If he does it immediately, Gorbachev falls from power earlier, and also the hardliners probably would have come to power sooner. What happens in the event is that the Soviet Union becomes so self-absorbed that they're ignoring Eastern Europe for 20 years. And it takes Putin 20 years plus for him to consolidate power to become a problem. And this gives an aperture for all these newly independent countries to integrate with the West politically, militarily, economically, allow the glue to set. But there's a cost for this. So Bush never brags. He doesn't get a second term. Americans hardly get it, that this is the guy who did a masterful job of war termination. All right, Anatoly Admishin would say, look, you're all crazy talking about Bush. It's all about Gorbachev. Look, it's the Soviet Union that put an end to the Cold War. They're the guys who quit. And Edwin Meese, who was a special counselor, special advisor to Ronald Reagan, as well as his attorney general, said, yeah, you know, the Cold War began because of the Soviet politics. In a sense, it ended because they changed their politics. And here you can see Gorbachev winning the Nobel Peace Prize for his liberation of Eastern Europe and his own people. Okay, I'm going to leave it to you to decide which one of these arguments that you find appealing or a combination. But I hope I've convinced you that a good answer to the question of why Russia lost the Cold War is more than this monothematic Ronald Reagan did it. Anyway, thank you very much. You own me. If there are any questions.
Okay. Hi, I really enjoyed your presentation. Thanks, Alex Carter, U.S. Army senior class. You didn't mention anything about the Marshall Plan. I think if we go way back, I'm thinking, you know, with the trajectory of the Soviet Union, was there a point much earlier on when we could have slowed